The knock at dawn shattered the silence like a gunshot. Clara Vogel pressed herself against the cold, cracked wall of the abandoned bunker, heart pounding, eyes wide with terror. Rumors had whispered horrors of what awaited captured women, but nothing prepared her for the British soldiers waiting outside. Their uniforms gleamed, their voices clipped yet calm. And then came something unimaginable, a kind smile, a blanket, a meal. In that moment, fear collided with disbelief. Could mercy exist in the middle of war? Tonight, Clara would find out, and what she discovered would shake everything she thought she knew about. Enemies. May 8, 1945, Northern Germany. The war was over. But for Clara Vogel and the other young women of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, freedom was a confusing stranger, starving, frightened, and huddled in a bunker that smelled of damp and decay. They were dragged into a world they had been warned would destroy them. Britain. The word felt alien, almost unreal. Yet as they arrived at Hawthorne Camp, the impossible began to unfold. Barracks warm with wood smoke, clean blankets waiting for each girl, meals that smelled like life itself, meals they hadn't tasted in months, maybe years. Every gesture of care challenged the stories drilled into their minds, the propaganda that painted all enemies as monsters. Clara and the others would soon learn that captivity could be more than punishment. It could reveal something else: humanity. The shock of kindness, the taste of real food, the sound of music in a camp that was supposed to break them. All of it became a quiet rebellion against fear and hatred. Before we continue, like, comment, and subscribe. These stories remind us that even in war's darkest corners, small acts of mercy can change lives forever. The morning fog hung low over the German countryside as Clara Vogel and 7 other young women were herded onto the waiting trucks. Their fingers were numb, their stomachs aching from days without proper food. Clara's mind drifted briefly to her home in Lübeck, to the tiny apartment she had shared with her mother and younger brother, now likely reduced to rubble. She shook the thought away. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. The British soldiers were silent, efficient, yet not cruel. Clara noted the way their boots crunched over broken glass without a trace of malice, the way their eyes met hers with curiosity rather than hatred. She clutched the thin fabric of her uniform, worn through in places, and wrapped her arms around herself. Every step toward the trucks felt like walking into a new world. The convoy rumbled through devastated towns, past burned-out factories and skeletal homes. The silence among the women was thick, broken only by the occasional sob from the youngest, Annika, barely 18, whose scarf slipped to reveal tear-streaked cheeks. Clara reached out, squeezing her shoulder in quiet solidarity. No words were needed. The shared fear spoke louder than language. After hours of travel, the convoy arrived at a holding camp near Osnabrück. Rows of tents stretched across muddy fields, surrounded by barbed wire. The women were separated into groups and processed methodically. Each girl was photographed, fingerprinted, and examined by British medics. The routine was efficient, clinical, and for Clara, terrifying. She feared the worst at every step. Stories of punishment and abuse had been drilled into their minds for years, but all she found was care. A medic handed her a clean towel and a bar of soap, and for a moment, Clara froze. The smell of carbolic soap stung her nose, but it was a shockingly normal, human gesture. The nights at Osnabrück were cold, damp, and uncertain. Clara lay on the thin mattress, staring at the tent's canvas roof. Outside, other prisoners murmured softly, sharing scraps of gossip and memories. She thought of Greta, her dormitory companion back in Hanover, who had died during a bombing raid. The memory brought a pang of grief that she pressed down hard, swallowing it before it could escape. Survival demanded it. Finally, the day came for transport to Britain. Clara climbed onto the ship, the gray sea stretching endlessly in front of her. She had never seen an ocean so vast and terrifying. The crossing was rough, the waves slammed against the hull, and many of the women became ill. Clara pressed her forehead against the cold metal wall, breathing shallowly, and closed her eyes. She thought of home again, of her mother's gentle voice, of the smell of freshly baked bread that had long vanished from her life. These memories were her talismans, small lights in the overwhelming darkness of uncertainty. When the ship docked at Dover, it rained steadily. The women were led to a bus that would take them to Hawthorne Camp, a converted racetrack 20 miles west of London. The fence topped with coils of wire loomed before them, and the rows of low wooden barracks seemed ordinary yet alien. Clara's stomach twisted with apprehension. Would they be punished here, abused, left to die? But the first thing that struck her was the smell: warm, inviting, a fragrance she hadn't encountered in months. Smoke from the kitchens mingled with the crisp British air, carrying the aroma of roasted meat, baked bread, and vegetables. It was disorienting. The second thing was the sight of clean, orderly barracks. Each girl was assigned a cot with a real mattress, blankets, and a pillow. The simplicity of these gestures, something she had long taken for granted at home, filled her with disbelief. The processing continued inside a small building at the camp. A Red Cross official, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, interviewed each girl. Clara spoke cautiously, recounting her service as a typist in the signals unit, carefully avoiding exaggeration or omission. She had never fired a weapon, never harmed anyone, and the official listened without judgment. Then came the moment they had all dreaded, their first meal. They were led into a dining hall with long trestle tables and institutional green walls. Clara froze at the doorway. The tables were set with trays laden with food, roast beef glistening with fat, boiled potatoes, carrots, thick slices of white bread, and, impossibly, small squares of chocolate. Around her, the other girls hesitated, eyes wide, some already trembling. Tears streamed down the cheeks of Annika, and another girl whispered a shaky prayer under her breath. Clara approached slowly, every instinct urging her to run, to reject the generosity, to brace for punishment. But no one stopped her. She picked up the fork, the metal cool and real, and speared a piece of roast beef. The taste exploded across her tongue, rich and savory, a sensation so simple yet overwhelming. Tears welled in her eyes, and she allowed them to fall freely, unable to contain the emotions that had been locked inside for months around her. The room was alive with similar reactions. Girls who had endured starvation for weeks, even months, wept quietly as they took in the sheer abundance. The British guards watched without scorn, offering words through interpreters, encouraging them to eat as much as they needed. Clara realized, with a mixture of astonishment and guilt, that the enemy she had been taught to fear was showing them nothing but humanity. For the first time since the war had begun, Clara felt a fragile sense of safety. She did not understand it, could barely believe it, but she knew one thing: survival had brought her here, and for the first time in months she could rest without fear. The days at Hawthorne Camp settled into a rhythm Clara could not have imagined a week earlier. Breakfast arrived like clockwork, steaming porridge with real milk, sugar, and slices of bread, simple luxuries, yet miraculous after weeks of turnip soup and stale black bread. Clara sat beside Annika, watching the younger girl nibble carefully, still hesitant to trust the generosity before her. "Do you think it's safe?" Annika whispered, her voice trembling. Clara shook her head slowly, unsure if she had an answer. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we're here. For now, that has to be enough." The camp itself was orderly, almost serene in its discipline. The barracks were warm and clean, each woman assigned a cot with blankets and a pillow. There were showers with hot water, and soap that no longer burned the skin raw. Laundry duties came next, and Clara found herself assigned alongside Greta, a spirited brunette from Bavaria who had somehow survived the chaos of the retreat. They scrubbed the linens of the camp staff, the washboards biting at their knuckles, steam rising around them like a comforting veil. It was hard work, yet it reminded Clara of the small domestic chores back home, folding laundry with her mother, polishing the floors, simple routines that grounded her in a world that no longer made sense. Even the guards defied her expectations. Young men in their 20s, weary from war themselves, patrolled without anger or cruelty. One, a red-haired corporal with freckles and a shy smile, brought tea to the women during afternoon breaks. He joked through the interpreter that his mother would scold him if he didn't serve the ladies properly, and Clara found herself laughing, a sound she had not made in months. The others joined in, some tentatively, others with full-hearted relief. Humanity, she realized, could be contagious. Clara's roommate, Helene, was quiet, introspective, a girl from Hanover who had worked in a field hospital before being drafted into the labor corps. Helene shared little at first, her eyes always scanning, watching, wary of the world around her. But gradually, she opened up and fragmented stories of wounded soldiers, the horrors of makeshift surgeries, the small acts of mercy that had allowed her to survive. Clara listened, captivated, realizing that each woman carried a story of loss, fear, and resilience. Even the youngest, Annika, began to reveal her fears. She whispered about the rumors of punishment for captured women, the horrors she had imagined in every dark corner. Clara held her hand, letting the warmth of human touch speak louder than any reassurances could. Meals became the center of their days, a ritual of rediscovery. Roast beef, vegetables, bread, and chocolate, a seemingly ordinary feast transformed into an emotional battleground. The women cried quietly, choking back laughter and sobs, as the abundance made their previous deprivation painfully vivid. Clara wrote in her small diary, each evening, recording the strange dissonance of gratitude and guilt, fear and relief. Outside of meals, the women found small freedoms. Walks around the camp, supervised but gentle, allowed them to feel the sun on their faces, to notice the green of trees, the bright blue of the sky, a stark contrast to the rubble and ash they had left behind in Germany. They began to play small games, quietly at first, card games, whispered storytelling, even simple songs hummed to pass the evening hours. The sound of laughter, almost foreign, became a balm for the bruised souls of the camp. The British officers and Red Cross volunteers encouraged learning and expression. Clara and Helene attended lessons in hygiene, nutrition, and basic English, bridging the gap between fear and understanding. Clara struggled with the words at first, stammering through please and thank you, but the tutors never scolded. Instead, they smiled patiently, guiding her with kindness, a lesson more profound than any classroom could offer. Yet, even amidst this unexpected civility, Clara felt the lingering weight of the war she had left behind. Nightmares came unbidden, replaying raids, lost friends, and moments of terror. She would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, only to find the safety of the cot, the warmth of the blankets, and the quiet breathing of other women beside her. Slowly, she realized that survival was no longer only about escape, it was also about learning to live again. Clara also observed the small acts of rebellion in others, not against the guards, but against the fear itself. Annika dared to sing softly during dinner, Greta added humor to chores, and Helene began to sketch in the margins of her diary, drawing memories of home she could not otherwise voice. Each act, no matter how tiny, was a reclamation of humanity. Even the meals continued to surprise them. Every tray was replenished generously, and the novelty of choice bewildered Clara. Apples and oranges, meat and vegetables, pastries and chocolate, it was overwhelming. A feast that symbolized something far beyond nourishment. It was a statement of normalcy, of trust, of life continuing even after unimaginable loss. By the end of the first week, Clara noticed subtle changes. Her hands were no longer permanently trembling, her stomach less clenched, and her mind less consumed by fear. She began to notice the small kindnesses of those around her, internalizing the lesson that compassion could persist even in the aftermath of destruction. The war had ended, yet its shadows lingered. But Hawthorne Camp, in all its surprising warmth, offered Clara and her fellow prisoners a chance to begin again, not as enemies, not as victims, but as women reclaiming the fragile remnants of their humanity. The weeks at Hawthorne Camp stretched into a strange rhythm of discipline and quiet discovery. Clara had begun to recognize faces, the subtle patterns of those around her. Greta, ever the joker, had claimed the corner cot closest to the window, where the sun spilled in during morning roll call. She often whispered exaggerated stories about life back home, about cows that could talk and neighbors who were secret spies. Clara would laugh quietly, the sound foreign but freeing. Helene, meanwhile, remained reserved, her gaze always alert to every movement in the barracks. Yet she had started keeping a journal, filling the pages with sketches of landscapes she could no longer visit, the familiar German countryside replaced by the English fields surrounding the camp. Clara often watched her, fascinated by the way Helene's pencil moved with precision and care, as if mapping out a life she hoped to reclaim. Annika, the youngest among them, had discovered a peculiar delight in small routines. She collected scraps of cloth, sewing them into tiny dolls that reminded her of home, whispering stories to them at night. Clara sometimes caught her humming softly while working in the laundry, a tune so fragile it seemed to float on the steam rising from the wash basins. The camp itself had become a world apart from what they had feared. The officers were not monsters, as they had been taught to expect. Instead, young men, barely older than Clara herself, moved quietly through the barracks, offering help when needed, keeping order without cruelty. Corporal Finley, the red-haired boy with freckles, had become a symbol of unexpected kindness. He would bring tea and biscuits during the afternoon, often with a shy grin and a joke that required translation. He had once brought a small flower he had found by the fence, pressing it carefully between the pages of a notebook for Clara to see. Evenings became a time of reflection and camaraderie. The women gathered in the common room, where someone had set up a gramophone. They listened to British dance bands, American jazz, and once, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Clara had never felt music this way before, the notes lifting some invisible weight from her chest, connecting her to emotions she had buried for months. Helene sat quietly, tracing the edges of the sheet music, while Greta tapped her feet, unable to resist the rhythm. Annika simply closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her completely. Yet, amidst these moments of wonder, shadows lingered. Clara often woke in the night drenched in sweat, reliving memories she could not name without trembling. She had nightmares of the bunker in northern Germany, the cold, the hunger, the fear. She would wake to find Greta's cot empty, Helene's journal open, Annika clutching her doll, and realize that despite the horrors behind them, survival demanded more than endurance, it demanded adaptation. Meals continued to be a revelation. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and chocolate became not just nourishment, but symbols of the world they had been taught to fear. Clara remembered the first time she had lifted a fork, the taste of meat so rich it brought tears to her eyes. Around her, the women cried quietly, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and grief over the months of deprivation. Each bite was both an indulgence and an accusation, a reminder that the fear and lies of war could be undone by simple acts of kindness. The women began sharing stories and fragments, accounts of families lost, friends vanished, and the fleeting glimmers of hope they had clung to during the darkest days. Helene spoke of soldiers she had tended in the field hospital, of screams and blood and the desperate longing to save lives that seemed already claimed by fate. Greta laughed through tears as she recalled absurd, small moments of levity amid chaos. Annika's voice trembled as she described nights hiding in barns, listening to the distant thunder of artillery while clutching her mother's shawl. Clara listened, recording details in her diary, understanding that this sharing was more than conversation. It was a way of rebuilding trust, of reaffirming that their identities were more than their survival. One afternoon, a Red Cross volunteer brought news that packages from home had arrived. Clara's hands shook as she opened a small parcel from her mother, a letter, a bar of chocolate, and a scarf she had worn as a child. The smell of home enveloped her, and she pressed the scarf to her face, crying quietly. Greta and Annika leaned close, offering small smiles and gentle words, Helene nodding solemnly, understanding without needing to speak. The days were also punctuated by small victories. A cake was made for Greta's birthday, crudely shaped but filled with care. They sang softly in German, their voices wavering but sincere. Clara watched the moment, the laughter, the tears, the bonds forming, and realized that even in captivity, even amid the remnants of war, life could assert itself in the most unexpected ways. Yet there was a lesson Clara could not ignore. The kindness she experienced was foreign because it was rare, and its presence demanded reflection. Every act of care, from the hot showers to the chocolate, from the gentle words to the shared music, was a statement against the cruelty they had anticipated. It forced them to reconsider everything they had been taught about the world, about enemies, and about themselves. By the end of the month, Clara understood that survival was no longer only a matter of endurance. It was about claiming fragments of life that remained, recognizing humanity where it seemed impossible, and letting small acts of kindness, music, laughter, and trust become the tools of healing. Autumn had settled over Hawthorne Camp, painting the English fields outside the barbed wire in shades of gold and crimson. Clara stood at the barracks window, watching leaves swirl in the wind, her fingers pressed against the cold glass. It was hard to believe how much life had changed in just a few months. The once dreaded British camp had become a strange sanctuary, a place where survival was no longer measured only by endurance, but by connection, care, and the faint return of hope. The announcement came one crisp morning. A list of women had been approved for early repatriation, on compassionate grounds. Clara's heart pounded as her name appeared. Helene, Greta, and Annika crowded around her, eyes wide with happiness and sorrow. "You'll write to us, won't you?" Greta said, her voice thick with emotion. Helene simply nodded, pressing a small folded note into Clara's hand. Annika hugged her tightly, whispering, "Don't forget us." Clara clutched them back, tears streaming freely, the bittersweet weight of parting already settling over her chest. The journey home was a mixture of disbelief and awe. The women were escorted to Dover, where they boarded a ship that felt enormous and unfamiliar. Clara pressed herself against the railing for a brief moment, the salty wind stinging her eyes, the gray horizon stretching infinitely before her. She thought of the barracks, the laughter and tears shared, the music that had soothed so many nights, and she wondered if she would ever find a place as strange and comforting again. The trip across the channel was rough, but it gave Clara time to reflect. Helene had given her a small notebook filled with sketches. Greta had smuggled a chocolate bar into her bag, and Annika had tucked a tiny cloth doll inside her coat. These tokens of memory and friendship would travel with her, reminders of resilience and unexpected grace. Each wave that slapped against the hull seemed to echo both the horrors of the past and the strange, quiet miracles of the present. When the train finally rumbled into northern Germany, Clara's breath caught at the sight of familiar ruins. Buildings she had known as a child were shattered, streets she had run along now lined with rubble. But the scent of earth after rain carried a whisper of home. Her mother and father waited at a small rebuilt apartment, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope. Her mother's scream of relief tore through the station, and Clara ran into her arms, holding back the flood of emotion that had been accumulating for months. Her father's silent embrace followed, grounding her in the reality of survival. The reunion was more than just a family moment. It was the reclaiming of identity. Clara could now speak of the camp, of the meals that had seemed impossible, the warmth of blankets, the music, and the quiet care of the young British soldiers who had treated her with dignity. She spoke cautiously, aware that the stories might seem unbelievable, yet every word was a testament to the complexity of humanity. Helene, Greta, and Annika remained at Hawthorne, their own departures pending, but letters began to flow. Clara wrote of her return, of seeing her family, of the small joys of home, and of the enduring bonds formed in captivity. Helene's sketches arrived in reply. Greta sent her drawings and jokes, and Annika enclosed tiny dolls with careful notes of encouragement. The letters were threads connecting them across distance and time, affirming that friendship and humanity were not bound by geography or circumstance. Months passed, and Clara began to rebuild a life. She returned to her work as a typist, this time assisting in post-war recovery efforts, often alongside former British administrators. Each day was a lesson in normalcy, in negotiating the ordinary after extraordinary events. She carried memories of Hawthorne Camp not as a wound, but as a quiet triumph of resilience and compassion. One evening, as winter approached, Clara sat at the small table in her apartment, a cup of tea warming her hands. She opened a tin sent from Annika, containing dried herbs and a note. "Remember the little miracles," she smiled, understanding that the kindness she had witnessed small meals, shared music, gentle words was as transformative as any grand event in history. Years later, Clara shared her story with her children and grandchildren. She spoke not to glorify any side, nor to excuse the horrors of war, but to bear witness to a truth that had reshaped her understanding of humanity. Even in the darkest hours, small acts of decency, empathy, and care could create spaces of healing and hope. The first British meal, once a source of disbelief and tears, had become a symbol of that truth. Clara, Helene, Greta, and Annika remained linked in memory, their lives forever touched by the paradoxical grace of the camp. They had been trained to survive, but in Hawthorne, they had learned to live again, learning that survival alone was not enough without human connection, understanding, and empathy. As Clara closed her diary each night, she wrote the same line she had scrawled months before: "Kindness is rebellion, compassion is victory." Even in war, humanity endures. The war had ended, but the lessons of Hawthorne Camp, the moments of care, laughter, and small joys remained. They were indelible marks on the lives of the women who had endured, a testament to the unexpected humanity that could bloom even amidst the ruins of conflict. And in the quietest moments, Clara remembered the first meal, the tears, and the soft music that carried them through the nights, understanding that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the heaviest truths. Stories like Clara's remind us that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness can change lives. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with someone who loves untold history, and subscribe for more incredible true stories from World War II. Don't miss our next episode because history is full of surprises you've never heard before.